In this lesson, we'll take a look at the different types of tissue membranes. So we have a lot of membranes in the body. We call them tissue membranes. Their job, one of their main jobs actually, is to be a physical barrier. They also line and cover body surfaces. So think about this for a minute. If you remember, lining and covering was the function of epithelium. So that means our membranes are going to have epithelium and then a little bit underneath it connective tissue, and usually that connective tissue is areolar connective tissue. So it's important for you to know, and you'll see this, I'll show you this now. It's important for you to know that our tissue membranes consist of a layer of epithelium supported by areolar connective tissue, and I'll show you some pictures of that. And it turns out we have four different types of membranes: the mucous membrane, serous, cutaneous, and then we'll finish up looking at synovial membranes. So let's take a look at the mucous membrane first. Very, very easy, guys. Any system that's open to the outside world, right? Think about this: respiratory system, digestive system, urinary system, reproductive system. All of those systems have openings to the outside world. That system is going to be lined on its entirety on the inside by a mucous membrane. And one of the reasons we need to have these systems with a mucous membrane is the epithelial surface of these systems needs to be moist. And that's important for the system to function. It's going to help to reduce friction, right, by the membranes producing moisture. It produces friction, and it also helps to facilitate any absorption that we're going to be doing, absorbing, say, nutrients for the digestive system, or secretion, right, getting rid of something from the body. Now, the areolar connective tissue underneath the epithelium in mucous membranes has a name. We call this the lamina propria. And again, that's a term you use, especially when you're in the lab looking at these mucous membranes under the microscope. Right? We call it the lamina propria, but all it is, it's the areolar connective tissue underneath the epithelium. So watch this. Here's a mucous membrane. This kind of dark line right here, this represents the basement membrane. And then we can see we have some simple columnar epithelium, a little bit of maybe cilia right over here. And you can see this cell right here, it has a pocket of mucus. Right? This is what we had learned in previous lessons as a mucus cell, or you may remember it begins with a G. If I was in class now, I would ask you, this would be the goblet cell, right? I'm sure you got that correct. Now the goblet cell is going to release the mucus, and look at this, there's the mucus on the top of the cell. So it's moisturizing all of the top of the epithelium. Okay, so we have the epithelial layer, and then we had said underneath is the areolar connective tissue here, right? That's going to support the epithelium. And again, in mucous membranes, we call this areolar tissue the lamina propria. Right? So this is a classic mucous membrane. Right? We'll have tons, not tons, but a lot, depending on where we are. You'll have a lot of these goblet cells. Right? If we were in the colon, believe it or not, you wouldn't have any cilia. We would have a lot of mucus cells, right? They would be a lot more than just one sitting here to help move the material through the colon. Another textbook, again, basement membrane here. Nice simple columnar cells right here. And then look, goblet cell, goblet cell, goblet cell, right? This has more goblet cells. And then the mucus goes up on top right over here. And then here's your lamina propria, areolar connective tissue right underneath the basement membrane. Okay, so those are the two components of the mucous membranes. Now, the next membrane that I want to discuss with you is known as the serous membrane. This membrane, or these membranes, line any cavity that is not open to the outside world. Right? So think about your body cavities that are inside. The two pleural cavities, which house the, again, if I was in class, I would ask you, which house the lungs. The pericardial cavity, which houses the heart, and then the abdominal pelvic cavity, which houses all the digestive and the reproductive organs, that type of thing. So all of those cavities are lined by this thin but strong serous membrane. Now we can divide the serous membrane into two parts. The serous membrane that's on the body cavity wall we call the parietal portion, right? And you may remember that parietal means wall. And then the same lining on the organs, right? If we put the organs in the cavity, is known as the visceral lining, right? So that's going to be the visceral portion. In future classes in anatomy, you may learn that that's also called the serosa. Now, this serous membrane produces a thin, slippery fluid. It's not a mucus, it's more of a thin, watery type of fluid known as serous fluid, and the job of that is to reduce the friction, right? So think about this. Your lungs inside your pleural cavities, they expand, and then when you breathe out, they go back down, right? They expand, and they go back down. Your heart's moving inside the pericardial cavity. Your stomach and intestines are moving around in our abdominal pelvic cavity. Anytime there's movement, there's friction. Friction produces heat. We can't have that, right? That would be bad. So this fluid helps to reduce that friction for us. So let's take a look. So here again, watch this. Basement membrane is the darker purple here, thin line, and then laying on it is some nice simple squamous cells, right? One layer of flat cells, right? They make up the serous membrane. They produce this fluid right here known as the serous fluid. Again, it's not a mucus. It's not thick. It's more watery. And then again, underneath here is the areolar connective tissue. Again, always remember that epithelium is going to be supported by areolar connective tissue. It's always going to be there. It's from another book. Again, here they show when you say the lining from the lung, right on top of the lung. This would be the visceral pleura. So areolar connective tissue again. The blue, darker blue would be the basement membrane. And then again, one layer of flat cells, and then they produce the serous fluid, which would be right over here. And again, that would reduce the friction as the lungs expand and then deflate, expand and then deflate, right? It would be the same thing if we looked at the heart right in here, right? That would have the same type of lining around it. Right? And again, these line cavities that do not open to the outside world, right? So we have names of these serous membranes. The pleura is the one that we would find in the pleural cavity. It's going to line the pleural cavity and also cover the lung. The pericardium lines the pericardial cavity and then also covers the heart. And then in the abdominal pelvic cavity, they call the lining the peritoneum. And again, it lines the cavity wall as well as covering the abdominal organs. Right? For those of you going into medicine, you'll actually deal with patients that get inflammation of these three linings. They call it a pleuritis, pericarditis, peritonitis, when sometimes people get an appendix or they get an ectopic pregnancy, that this lining becomes inflamed or infected and could be fatal. This membrane I just want to introduce because we're going to do a whole chapter on it. This is known as the cutaneous membrane. Anytime you hear cutaneous, think skin. Now, this is a much thicker membrane. It's relatively waterproof. And again, if you touch your skin right now, unless you're sweating profusely, your skin is usually dry. So it's not like a mucous membrane or a serous membrane that produce fluid. It's more of a dry membrane. So just to kind of give you an idea, this black line would represent the basement membrane, right? Like that whole black line. All of these cells here, this would be stratified squamous cells, right? Multiple layer of flat cells. All of these cells here are going to be the epithelium. And then again, there's always areolar connective tissue under epithelium. So here we have areolar connective tissue, and then a little bit further down, this is going to be dense irregular connective tissue. So the skin is actually made up again of epithelium. You may know this as the epidermis. And then the connective tissue under the epidermis, we're going to learn, is going to be called the dermis. And so it's a much thicker membrane compared to the two we just looked at. Again, different textbook. Again, from this squiggly line up, all of this is going to be your stratified squamous cells. That's the epithelium. And then all of the pink in here is going to be the connective tissue underneath. Okay. The last membrane that we want to cover and just kind of introduce is known as the synovial membrane. This lines joint cavities, right? Like your shoulder joint, your elbow joint, your wrist joints, your ankle joint, all that kind of stuff. This membrane will produce a fluid that we call synovial fluid, and that helps to lubricate and actually nourish the cartilage at the end of the bones. So it does have an epithelium, but we don't really call it a true epithelium. But for our purposes, just kind of think of it as an epithelium, even though it's not a true epithelium the way we've learned it so far this semester. So watch this. We have two bones. Here's one bone, and then here's another bone. The blue represents the hyaline cartilage. The little circles here represent the chondrocytes in lacuna. Right, and then here's another articular cartilage, right? So let's just say this was your finger joint, right? This is one of your finger bones, or let's say your pointer finger. Say the middle bone on your pointer finger, and this is the one closer to your hand, to your wrist. And then there's, notice guys, the two cartilage at the ends of the bones don't touch. There's a space, right? We actually call this the joint space. So the articular cartilage of one bone doesn't touch the articular cartilage of the other bone. Now this space in here is not empty. It's filled with a fluid we call synovial fluid. The synovial fluid is produced by, again, this red line right here would be the synovial membrane. Right, so these cells are producing that fluid. So what they did here is they took this synovial membrane and they blew it up for us. Here's the synovial fluid, that would be right there. And then here's the red line. Notice it's not a complete line of epithelial cells, so it's, they say it's not a true epithelium. Um, so that would be the cells making up the synovial membrane. And again, what's always underneath epithelial cells? Areolar connective tissue right there. All right, that's always going to be the same. Okay, so this membrane here is going to produce this fluid which bathes the hyaline cartilage, right? Helps to nourish the hyaline cartilage, that type of thing. Acts a little bit of a shock absorber also. Okay, and then here's our last slide. So this is just showing again from another book. Again, the light blue here would be the articular cartilage. Then there's a space, articular cartilage, but again, is that space empty? Nope, that's filled with fluid we call synovial fluid. And again, here they're just kind of blowing up the membrane. So here you see the epithelial cells, and then underneath it, the blue here is the areolar tissue. Okay, so that concludes this lesson on the tissues. Again, the four tissues are the mucous, tissue membranes, I should say, mucous membrane, the serous membrane, the cutaneous membrane, and then we finished up looking at the synovial membrane.